Hello, my name is Shannon Allen, and I'm a doctoral student at North Central University. Today I'm going to discuss Gestalt theory. This lecture will cover the history of Gestalt psychology, its definition, theoretical framework, methodologies, properties, theories, foundational theorists, research, and how Gestalt has influenced modern psychology. Gestalt was a school of psychology that emerged here in the early 1900s in Austria and Germany as a response against structuralism and behaviorism. It attempted to add humanistic elements to the scientific study of psychology, such as phenomenology, which we'll discuss later. By the mid-1930s, Gestalt was introduced to the United States. Gestalt is translated as a pattern or configuration, or how something has been put together or placed. The Gestalt theory proposed that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. As this pertains to the mind, Gestalt theory posited that humans simplify complex objects by subconsciously grouping them into parts to form a whole. They opposed the dominant schools of behaviorism and structuralism, believing that behaviorism excluded mental processes, and structuralism viewed the parts as more important than the whole. They also opposed the psychoanalysis movement, arguing that it put too much emphasis on passivity rather than willpower and intelligence. By examining basic reasons that could be adjusted to our natural method of perceiving reality, Gestaltists were particularly interested in how visual perceptions led to the acquisition of knowledge. They also focused on the interaction between perception, memory, and learning. However, they did not believe that these were separate processes, but rather had a dynamic and holistic relationship connected through reality. They also believed that each person's reality was distinctive because it was based on their unique past experiences. However, they conceded that psychological portrayals didn't relate totally with those that exist in reality. Rather, we build them ourselves and are able to adapt cognitive processes when new circumstances manifest. In other words, they argue that our mental processes interact to allow us to function and perform tasks. Gestaltists formulated the theoretical principles of totality and psychophysical isomorphism, which guided their methodologies. The principle of totality saw conscious experiences as holistic, or simultaneous interactions between the physical and mental self. In other words, the functions of the part depend upon the whole by which it is embedded. In terms of the fundamental Gestalt principle, the whole is greater than its parts, and the phenomenological methodology, the principle of totality infers that what could be predicted based only on individual parts would be different than observations of the perceptual whole. The principle of psychophysical isomorphism, in short, explains a correlational relationship between conscious perceptual experiences and brain activity. More specifically, isomorphism is described as an interaction between an arrangement of stimulus and how the brain perceives the stimulus. It's based on the idea that objectively recorded brain processes guide and are related to specific phenomenological encounters and functionally has the same pattern as subjective experiences. In other words, there's a positive correlation between the Gestalt patterning of a stimulus and the electrochemical reactions of brain activity while perceiving the stimulus. A common example of isomorphism is the phi phenomenon. Take this horse-drawn carriage, for example. The sequential flashing of the lights creates the illusion that the horse and carriage are moving forward. Gestaltists argued that our persistence of vision, which allows an image to remain visual even after the image has disappeared, helps the brain to interpret movement in static objects when the objects are presented in succession. They posit that this occurs because our minds are able to fill in or perceive the missing information, or in the case of a horse-drawn carriage, we can perceive what happens when the lights are not flashing, like old 8mm films where you can see the movie as a whole motion picture rather than a series of still frames. As previously mentioned, Gestaltists introduced a new approach to psychological research called phenomenology. While traditional early 20th century methodology focused on reducing the object of study's complexity by dividing it into and studying its basic elements, phenomenology directly investigated and described whole psychological experiences without theories of causation, presuppositions, and preconceptions. The phenomenon experimental analysis calls for phenomena to be taken as a starting point for research and should focus on more than sensory attributes. Biotic experimental analysis contrasted with the classical laboratory methodologies of the 1900s in that Gestaltists took a more natural approach to research, believing that studies would have higher fidelity if conducted in ordinary situations with realistic conditions that would allow researchers to observe subjects' habitual behaviors. I will discuss specific experiments later on in the lecture. Gestalt theory relied on 4 systems: emergence, reification, multistability, and invariance. Emergence is the idea that the brain can produce complex images from simple patterns by filling in the missing information. For example, this image appears to be little more than random shapes. However, if you look more closely, you will see a dog sniffing around a tree. While the dog isn't distinctly defined, we can still perceive it. Reification is the tendency to first consider an object as a whole before perceiving its parts. For example, you may perceive picture A as a triangle, though no triangle exists. You may perceive the contrasting shapes in B and D as belonging to a single shape. And you may perceive image C as a complete dimensional image when actually it is a mixture of flat shapes. Multistability is the tendency to see alternative interpretations of the same image. For example, Rubens' vase shows 2 ambiguous forms, one a vase and the other 2 people facing each other. This image shows a woman sitting in a chair, but the chair is also a man's face. Invariance refers to our ability to recognize objects as being the same even when they are distorted. For example, we can distinguish the objects in A, C, and D as different than those in B, even though A shows them in different positions and angles. C shows formations, and D shows different graphic components. Figure ground organization is a type of perceptual grouping that allows us to distinguish a figure from its background. We can do so because our brains interpret figures in terms of their shapes in relation to the location and layout of the surface. Figure ground organization is the idea that we can see figures as standing out and backgrounds as receding behind. For example, figures in the foreground are more defined, while those in the background are blurry. Contrast can also help us differentiate a figure from its background. Size is also important. The larger the image, the closer it will be perceived to be, and the smaller, the further away. Lastly, an isolated figure is most likely to be as an object rather than the background. What do you see when you look at this graphic depends on whether you see the red as the background and black as the figure, or black is the background and red is the figure. However, like the previously mentioned Rubens vase, most people can switch their perceptions back and forth, so they see both Batman and the Joker. Like figure ground organization, pragnans is another type of perceptual grouping. Pragnans refers to our tendency to perceive the world as orderly and concise by disregarding the complex and unfamiliar. By ignoring irrelevant stimuli, we perceive complex images in their whole and simplest forms. Gestaltists, however, wanted to break pragnans down into different elements to explain better how humans perceive reality in its simplest form. These laws address the sensory modality of vision. The law of proximity assumes that we perceive objects as groups when they are close to each other. For example, there are 72 dots in this graphic, but we tend to perceive them in three groups, one consisting of 36 dots and the other three composed of 12 dots each. A real-world example of proximity would be this IBM logo. Instead of seeing 8 horizontal lines, we see the letters IBM because there is a space between each letter, thus making the horizontal lines of each letter more salient. The law of similarity states that we tend to group objects that are similar to each other. For example, in this graphic, we tend to group all the dark dots together and all of the gray dots together, forming 6 equally spaced lines that form a square. The law of closure is related to reification. Remember, reification is the tendency to first consider an object as a whole before perceiving its parts. The law of closure states that our perception fills in the gaps to make a complete object, as seen in this example. We don't see random images, but rather we see a circle and a rectangle. In this contemporary example, what do you see? Unrelated shapes or a soccer ball? The law of symmetry states that the mind perceives objects as belonging to the same groups when they are symmetrical. Take this Bike Expo advertisement. While each half of the circle is different in color and texture, it resembles a circle because each half is symmetrical. The law of common fate explains how we perceive objects that move at the same speed and or the same direction as part of a single stimulus. An example of common fate would be a flock of birds. The law of continuity holds that we tend to perceive smooth, continuous lines rather than sharp, jagged directional changes as being uninterrupted objects. In this example, despite the color difference, we see a straight line and a curved line. Here is another example of how continuity helps us perceive shapes. Early Gestaltists studied problem solving from the perspective of insight. They were able to explain how we can go from knowing nothing about a problem to instantly understanding it and the solution. Take, for example, a 2-year-old who sees her favorite toy on the kitchen counter. She wants the toy badly, but she can't reach it. After some time, she realizes that she can slide a chair up to the counter, climb up on the chair, and reach her toy. Gestaltists believe that these instant solutions were due to productive thinking. Productive thinking involves reorganizing the relationship between the elements of a problem to come to a quick and creative solution. Reproductive thinking, on the other hand, applies past solutions to a new problem. However, the issue with reproductive thinking is that it may prevent us from perceiving a more straightforward solution. This is called the Einstellung effect, or set effect. Now let's look at the fundamental theorists behind the Gestalt movement. Max Wertheimer received his Ph.D. from the University of Würzburg in 1904, where he became interested in the perception of ambiguous and complex forms. Through his research, he found that children were able to solve problems when they understood the structures involved. In addition, he was interested in the perception of motion. While visiting Frankfurt, he purchased a stroboscope and noticed how the successive flashing lights appeared as motion. This later came to be known as the Phi phenomenon. The Phi phenomenon became the basis and the start of Gestaltism. Along with his assistants Wolfgang Kuhla and Kurt Kofka, he developed the Gestalt school to further study the Phi phenomenon and other areas of psychology from the perspective of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Wertheimer worked at both the University of Frankfurt and at Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin, where he founded the Psychological Research Journal that illustrated the phenomenological methodologies. As an affront to the educational protocols that focused on association rather than problem solving in terms of logic, grouping, and reorganization, he developed the concept of pragnans, which, as previously discussed, held that reality was determined by the entire experience rather than the individual components of perception and sensation. In 1933, Wertheimer fled the Nazi occupation of Germany and became a professor at the New School for Social Research in New York, where he wrote Productive Thinking, which primarily focused on creative thought processes. Wolfgang Kuhla's early studies were concerned with hearing. Like Wertheimer, he also taught at the University of Frankfurt, where he continued his auditory studies. In 1912, he and Kurt Kofka were subjects in perception research conducted by Wertheimer. Kuhla later turned his studies to problem solving and is well known for his research with chimpanzees that will be discussed in further detail later in the lecture. In addition to his classical work, The Mentality of Apes, he also published another notable work called Physical Gestalt in Rest and Stationary States, which examined the neurological processes related to perception. Like Wertheimer, Kuhla fled the United States in 1935, where he taught at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. Kurt Kofka received his Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Berlin in 1909. He is best known for his systematic application of Gestalt theory to a broad set of topics. One of his works, The Growth of the Mind, examined child psychology from the Gestalt perspective. Kofka frequently traveled to the United States, where he introduced Gestalt theory to many universities. In 1927, he was hired as a professor of psychology at Smith College in Massachusetts. While there, he published Principles of Gestalt Psychology that examined Gestalt ideas about perception, memory, and learning to applied psychology. Wertheimer was well known for his Phi phenomenon research. In his earliest study, he presented a participant with the light illuminated in the center of the visual field. This light was followed by short flashes to the right and the left. The participant reported seeing only a moving form rather than individual flashes. This experiment influenced the previously mentioned idea of persistence of vision that holds images remain visual even after the image has disappeared. Another study had participants view two images in quick succession. The first image showed a horizontal line on the left side of the screen, and the second image showed a horizontal line on the right side of the screen. While the participants perceived two lines, Wertheimer concluded that the participants perceived motion in the space-time between the two lines. He also concluded that images had to appear around 30 to 200 milliseconds after one another in order for participants to perceive that one line was moving from one location to another. Kuhla is perhaps most known for his experimental animal research. His chicken experiment gave credibility to his theory of transposition. To prove that experiences can be transposed to new circumstances, he trained chickens to eat food placed on a lighter or darker shade of two pieces of paper. When the chickens trained to lighter colored paper were offered a choice between the original color and a lighter color, they chose the lighter color. So the chickens were not necessarily concerned with the exact lightness, but instead they looked for their food on the lightest of the two. What Kuhla concluded was that the chickens had formed associations with a relationship rather than with a specific color. However, his work with primates is probably the most renowned because the results were transferable to humans. Kuhla presented food to chimpanzees that were not directly accessible and observed how they were able to obtain the food by constructing tools. These findings go to the idea of seeing the problem as a whole and using productive thinking, which I previously described as reorganizing the relationship between the elements of a problem to come to a quick and creative solution. This was in contrast to the dominant behavioral theories that held learning was a product of trial and error and conditioning. Kuhla also conducted research on isomorphism. In one experiment, he was able to use electrodes assorted over the occipital region of the brain to record neurological currents of humans in the natural state of walking and observing their surroundings. Within the discipline of cognitive psychology, Gestalt theory contributed to modern understandings of organizational learning and memory, parallel distributed processing, problem solving, reasoning and thinking, information processing, functional fixedness, schemas, scripts, and frames within the context of abstract thought, computer information processing models of cognition, and learning areas such as music, art, and reading. Gestaltists illustrated neural associations with perceptual organizations such as brightness, contour, contrast, orientation, aperture viewed motion, and filling in within the framework of isomorphism. This knowledge has allowed modern neuroscientists to utilize quantitative phenomenological methods to compare perceptive fields, receptive fields, memory, cognition, and their psychophysical correlates. Other neuropsychological areas that have advanced due to Gestalt influences are the theory of dynamic formation and recognition of pattern, and Leigh's transformation group approach to neuropsychology, or also known as geometric psychology. Many principles from early Gestalt psychology have influenced the clinical practice of Gestalt therapy. For example, the Gestalt emphasis on the whole translates to Gestalt therapy as how the whole person, including their cognitions, emotions, and so on, interact with the world. Figure ground theory translates as the client's dominant issues and their foreground issues. Transposition translates as emotional, behavior, or thought patterns that occur in different contexts. And closure translates to reconciling unresolved issues. So I have covered the very basics of the Gestalt movement, its fundamental theorists, and how it has influenced contemporary psychology. But like any other theory, experiment, or idea, Gestalt predecessors used Veltheimer, Kulla, and Kafka's findings and propositions as a base to further their knowledge in areas such as memory, communication, relationships, attitudes, and the arts. In closing, I will leave you with a few theories that evolved from Gestaltism that I find personally fascinating. Reyna and Brainerd's fuzzy trace theory of memory describes true memories and the phenomena of false memories. Newcomb's theory of communicative acts explains the role communication plays in maintaining social equilibrium. Heider's balance theory delineates how our attitudes and beliefs change over time. And Narmore's implication realization model of melodic expectations outlines how music listeners cognitively analyze melodic structures in terms of chords, patterns, tempos, intervals, and dynamics.